I will say hello and a proper welcome to this evening's event on levelling up histories, cultures, challenges. I'm Catherine Clark. I'm a professor at the Institute of Historical Research, and I'm director of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, one of the co-hosts for tonight's event, along with History and Policy, based at the IHR, and the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities at the University of Southampton. I'm going to start with just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we ask that you keep your microphone muted, please, when you're not speaking to avoid background noise. But we encourage you to leave your camera on if you're comfortable with that and if you've got the internet bandwidth. It's so nice to see faces in the virtual room while we're speaking. This event is going to be recorded, so please do bear that in mind if you choose to appear on camera or ask a question. We also suggest that you keep the chat box open. It's a good way to stay in touch with any information messages, and you can also share discussion. There will be an opportunity later in the event to ask questions, and you can do that either through the chat box or by raising your hand using the Zoom function. You'll have noticed that we have live captions on screen. You do have the option to switch those off at the bottom of the screen. And finally, if you're that way inclined, please do share tonight's discussion on social media using any one of those Twitter handles that you care to select, and perhaps the hashtag levelling up. So before we move to our brilliant lineup of speakers, chaired by Professor Philip Murphy, some very short introductions. As you've heard, I'm director of the IHR's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. We aim to foster engaged, innovative research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban, from the parish to the metropolis. And we bring together academics, heritage professionals, community groups, creative practitioners, policymakers, and all those interested in places and their stories. We're home to projects like the Victoria County History of England, which has been producing the leading research in English local history for over 120 years and now even has its own smartphone app. And this project is largely powered by networks of volunteers and researchers across the country. Or the Heritage Lottery funded crowdsourced history project, Layers of London. And we're particularly interested at the moment in how research into placed history and heritage can inform the futures of communities and help shape policy. We're partners in the AHRC funded project Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery, which has provided the starting point for this evening's event, and which you're going to hear a little bit more about now from the project lead, Professor Nikki Marsh. And Nikki, I will hand over to you right now if you'd like to start sharing your screen. Thanks.
So I, along with Catherine, am working on a project called Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery, a new multidisciplinary mapping, which is the kind of the occasion for thinking about the levelling up agenda tonight. And along with Catherine, I'm working with Will May and our senior research associate, Michael Howcroft, on this project. And Michael is full-time on the project, so I defer to him at all times. We are a team of cultural geographers, cultural critics and historians, and our interdisciplinary expertise is stretched further by the partners on our project. So we're working with the Centre for Towns and Will Jennings, I can see him in the corner of my screen, as well as Historic England and the Arts Council in particular. And the focus of the project is the Towns Fund. We're following the Towns Fund almost in real time as it disperses government funds across the course of this year. And our interest is in the ways in which, by exploring the ways in which towns bid for this money, what they think culture can do, and the roles that they think culture can play, particularly in economic regeneration. And it offers us a chance to work really closely with policymakers, decision makers, and local communities as they're imagining their towns and the role of culture in their towns in a kind of post-pandemic era. And the Towns Fund is clearly a major part of the levelling up agenda. It's a kind of major lever in that project. So one of the ways we're doing is we're thinking about what political languages, what cultural languages are surrounding this regenerative bid, and how they've changed. So you can see this is from Hansard, the amount of time that levelling up has been used in Parliament, and you can see it's used a little bit, these little arrows in the 2000s. It's used around education. Then suddenly in 2019 and 2020, 2021, it becomes one of the major political discourses, and we're interested in what kind of work that's doing. And for comparison, we can compare it to other kinds of watery languages for distribution that the Conservative Party likes. So we can compare levelling up to trickling down. So you can see that trickling down kind of went into abeyance in the kind of mid-years of New Labour, but then appeared again in Cameron's years, but then goes down because levelling up has taken over in some ways, that kind of language. So we're interested in what does this political language do, and what does this political language do for towns in particular, and for the ways in which culture is seen in towns. But it's clear that levelling up isn't only used in terms of this kind of this watery metaphor that has been used in economic modelling for a long time, where money can be distributed by policy by pulling certain levers. The language of levelling up does other things, and this is taken from an article in Prospect magazine. So the second way in which the way levelling up functions is it suggests game playing. It suggests the idea that this is certainly what my sons do, is that they move up a level, that you've increased your power in some ways. It's the way in which it's commonly used. But the way in which it was first used by Boris Johnson when he announced his leadership was a language of cars, was the language of combustion and energy and movement. But Simon Lancaster has pointed out, when you've got a metaphor that's doing three things, it's really stopped being a metaphor. It's a kind of confusing thing. Levelling up can't simultaneously be a car, a tide, and a game, Simon Lancaster suggests. It's a kind of mixed metaphor that would make Jim Hacker blush. And the metaphor needs to be settled. This is important. Without clarity of metaphor, there won't be clarity of thought or action. So one of the things we're doing in our project, as I was saying, we're kind of cultural critics, language critics, is thinking around what these languages are doing. And we're thinking of doing that as we're following the town fund. The town fund is being dispersed in quite kind of complicated tranches. So the first thing that we looked at was the accelerated funding that was announced last year, and the ways in which public art, community and cultural hubs, and heritage development was used in that project. And we were also interested in, as I think was everyone in this call, when the ways in which the 45 towns that were being identified for particular funding in this year's budget, the kind of political implications of that selection as well. What we're really interested in then is how culture's being used. And in some ways, culture's being used in this fund in the ways in which you'd imagine. It's for regeneration and town centre investment. It's to upgrade eyesore buildings, dated infrastructure, acquire and regenerate brownfield sites, invest in community infrastructure. It's to make people who want to stay in towns in particular. And you can see all these pictures are infrastructure that are being redeveloped with the accelerated funding. So we've got kind of department stores, fire engines, bus stations being turned into community hubs across the country. It's one of the things that is happening. But the language, I think, is really important for what culture is imagined to be doing in the levelling up prospectus, which this is taken from. Because the levelling up prospectus allies a notion of economic regeneration, which we expect to see here, with something that's much more kind of amorphous and difficult to pin down. And the "and" in these sentences is doing a lot of work. So town centre improvements help local businesses and cement pride in place. Cementing pride in place is an interesting idea. They strengthen the local economy and build civic pride. And the most powerful economic barometer of success that's suggested in their town centre is the positive change that they see and the pride that they feel in the places they call home. And certainly our research with the people who are doing this is our project, is looking at the towns, talking to the decision makers in towns, talking to these local communities, as that these emotional and visceral levers are certainly there. So when we ask towns boards to describe their futures, they use words like innovative, imaginative, creative, ready, vibrant. These very physical, visceral words are the ways in which towns are imagining that culture can regenerate. It's not only about economic regeneration, it's about this sense of place, a sense of pride, and that they become much more difficult to measure. They become much more difficult to know what we do with. So we're kind of just halfway through the project now, so we're just going to touch on the three kind of the three results that we're seeing in terms of the Towns Fund. The first is that the languages and aspirations for towns are about affect and emotional governance. They're about a sense of place, and towns are being encouraged to employ professional storytellers to tell their stories, to tell what's specific about their places. The second thing we're seeing is there's a narrow demographic of decision makers. There's little or no racial diversity, and the average age is between 50 and 70. And this narrowed range of decision makers is made even more narrow by the narrow range of consultants who are being employed to work with decision makers on these towns. And the third thing, the thing that we're most interested in here, is the capacity of local governments to deliver these towns have themselves been stretched. The skills, the expertise, the knowledge, the histories are not necessarily where they need to be to deliver these ambitious plans in the timescales that towns have been given to develop them. So where we're going next, where the kind of questions for us as we go forward in this project is we're going to work with towns, we're doing surveys, interviews, focus groups, and then a series of workshops in our case studies towns to understand the cultural ecosystems, to understand the tensions between regional, national, and international structures and identities, to seek more dynamic and inclusive forms of consultation and decision making, and particularly to think about what it means to measure, to evaluate this, what they're calling an economic barometer of civic pride. Now, so that's a kind of sense of where we are, of where this evening's event comes from, I hope is useful. I'm very pleased to be able to hand over the chairing of the event to Professor Philip Murphy, who is the Director of History and Policy. Thanks, Philip.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I'm Director of History and Policy. I'm also currently Acting Director of the Institute of Historical Research, which is the country's national centre for history. And I know one is in danger of wringing one's hands and saying how terrible things are now, but I can't remember a time when history was so heavily politicized. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means people are passionate about history, they're talking about history, but too often history is framed at the moment in terms of the concerns of a metropolitan elite versus, if you like, a kind of patriotic people's history. And whatever you think about the levelling up agenda, or indeed the phrase levelling up, it's very important for historians to show that they are speaking beyond the concerns of a kind of a narrow set of academics, that they're actually talking to popular concerns, that they're connecting with local concerns and local issues. And the IHR is based in a lovely building, Senate House, but it's very redolent of Bloomsbury. And one of the things that the lockdown has enabled us to do is to use Zoom technology to talk nationally and internationally, not just to historians and scholars around the world, but to a range of different audiences. And so I think it's important that we use this, and we have another kind of secret weapon at the IHR, which has returned to its original home, and that is history and policy. And indeed, amongst our distinguished speakers today is Simon Streeter, who was one of the academic parents of history and policy back in 2002. It moved back to the IHR in January, and it's an important, incredibly important tool for connecting historians. It's a network of over 500, mostly UK-based historians, but connecting historians with policymakers, activists, journalists, ensuring that the very highest quality of history is fed into national debates and policymaking. But also, I think, in this highly politicized atmosphere that I talked about, providing a neutral venue in which historians can talk to policymakers in conditions of trust. And so I think what we're going to try and do today is bring together a group of people who will have very different takes on this issue of levelling up, and open a debate. And I hope that everyone here will feel free to take part in the debate through the chat function. Please, if a question or thought occurs to you while one of our speakers is talking, don't hesitate, just use the chat function, and I'll feed the questions and comments back to our panelists at the very end. They are determined to be very good and keep to time, ideally around 5 minutes. And that's why we've framed these things as lightning talks. And our first lightning speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Melissa Benn, who is a distinguished alumnus of this Federal University from the LSE, and a writer of both fiction and non-fiction, including, I mean, one of my favorite books on the British education system, School Wars, The Battle for Britain's Education. Let me introduce Melissa and give her the floor. Melissa, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? I'm not
yeah.
on. Great. There's thunder outside my window, and that's probably the government coming down on me for what I'm about to say. I'm very glad that I'm the first speaker. I'm being true to my commission, which is to give a short, I've timed it, I hope it won't be longer than 5 minutes, a short provocation. So the other reason I'm very glad to be asked to speak here is that actually, as so often when asked to talk, I've learned a great deal. It's made me think quite seriously and get a little bit depressed, to be honest, about what somebody referred to a minute ago, about the new political and economic landscape in which we find ourselves, in which at the moment a political right narrative of a metropolitan elite being behind sort of a popular, patriotic northern Brexit voting population, and the government speaking for one and marginalising the other. And I just don't think that's the story of our country, and I don't want to let that be the story of our country. But what I see is that this rather elusive Johnsonian slogan, levelling up, is at the heart of this new situation and this new narrative. So my contribution tonight is going to largely concentrate on education and what levelling up might or might not mean in this context. And I'm going to do it through 3 brief points. The first, because I know we're looking at history and language, is that it occurred to me when I was thinking about this, that the history of English education has been peppered with terms that have at various points shaped policy and defined public debate, but often, in my view, to little or to dangerous effect. And so 2 very obvious examples is meritocracy, which was the term coined by sociologist Michael Young in his satire, The Rise of the Meritocracy, at which he did in order to sketch a nightmare world of an elite chosen for its higher intelligence rather than for its birth, yet was used entirely unironically by New Labour in the early years of its education policy. And the second term is social mobility. And this is an idea that is absolutely, I'd love to see how that came up in the Hansard analysis that you did about trickling down. But social mobility has been used constantly and is based around the idea that the coalition used that education can be used and should be a key driver to lift individuals out of poverty and lift them into a different social class. Now, my point is a simple one. These terms come and go, and they always go. And I think levelling up will go quicker than most. I think it will go quicker than most because from what I understand from focus groups and groups like Public First, who are checking out the term, nobody understands really what it means in the popular arena. But no one uses meritocracy now. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And social mobility is a decidedly frayed term, because despite government claims of ever higher educational standards, the attainment gap between social classes remains stubbornly fixed and is now growing, while the selectively and privately educated continue to gain disproportionate access to top universities and top jobs. And in fact, it is extraordinary how structurally unchanged the English education landscape remains, despite the considerable expansion of opportunity, as Peter Mandler outlines in his excellent book about the crisis of meritocracy. Amazing expansion since 1944, amazing no change. So I see levelling up as, I'm afraid, I don't think it will make that much change. So my second point is that social class obviously remains the single biggest shaper of educational chances wherever you are. And we do need to remember that this applies to everywhere, not just to the north, not just to towns, not just to the deindustrialized areas. And COVID has brutally illuminated this vast digital divide and the problem of widespread family hunger. Yet this levelling up government or Prime Minister, I think, has rather demeaned itself by wrangling with one determined footballer over the provision of food to poorer children during school holidays. More to the point, in terms of a levelling up agenda, it has announced a new school funding formula that, despite its claims to reach a fairer settlement, in fact its claims to be a levelling up policy, will, according to the Education Policy Institute, which is always worth following for its analysis of these things, it will benefit children in better off areas, and it begins to, says the EPI, open quote, unravel the connection between educational funding and educational disadvantage. And just to bring this home, overall, the average pupil eligible for free school meals under this new formula would attract an additional £56 per year. Remember, this is per pupil per year, while the average pupil not eligible for free school meals will attract an additional 116. All but 12, second example, all but 12 of England's 163 grammar schools, most of which are located in the affluent south and southeast and serving affluent populations, will benefit under this proposal at an average of over 130,000 each to their total budgets. My point is, this is redistribution in the wrong direction. Language is one thing, political rhetoric is another. Knockabout discussion in Parliament and question time is all one thing and is part of politics, but we have to look at whether the government is doing what it says. And the third and final point I want to make is that none of the above dismisses the need for greater rebalancing of investment in the towns that Nikki was describing so interestingly, and the cities of the north. And my wholly unoriginal observation here is that levelling up, I can only see it as primarily a political project, a vote winning and now a vote retention strategy, rather than a genuine vision for change, certainly in education. I therefore want to suggest that in place of some speedily built pieces of public infrastructure, and let's be honest, they're running out of time to do that before the next election, and their own advisors have pointed that out, but ideas like selective sixth forms in red wall districts. And I don't know how quite that would work with a towns policy, because so many towns are quite small in population, but it's an idea that's been suggested. I think we need sober, long-term solutions in those areas that have suffered underinvestment and lack of official attention for decades. And so just to say what I think we do need is, we need increasing funding for economically disadvantaged pupils through the pupil premium. There has been a long-term lack of experienced or even qualified teachers in many poorer towns and cities, and what we would do much better to develop attractive local recruitment packages, as suggested by a recent Sutton Trust report. And I'm deliberately using reports from those who are not on the political left, because I think we're now in a new era in terms of the old right-left divide. And I think we have to look at evidence. I think we need to give the newly devolved regions greater say over what they think should happen to schools and colleges in towns and cities. As Andy Burnham said this morning, you know, they're living it. And I think we need a coherent policy of adult education that goes well beyond the government's recent proposals for a lifetime skills guarantee. Skills recovery, a boost to skills education, is obviously a huge part of levelling up. But according to the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, which sat for a year and of which I was a member, we need to go much further and to foster what they call life-wide, what we call life-wide education. So that would include, for instance, a community learning centre in every town, funds for community groups so they can shape their own learning, a regional adult learning partnership, which goes back to my point that those in those areas should decide it. Even before COVID, 9 million adults in England struggled with reading, writing and basic computing skills. So we need more projects like the Rochdale Citizens Curriculum, which builds the learning and life skills of the most marginalised adults. And we need a return of the Union Learning Fund, or something like it, which was brutally axed by Gavin Williamson this March, which helped 250,000 low-skilled workers every year to access education at whatever level allowed them to enter education. So in conclusion, I remain sceptical of the government's plans. If you haven't come to that conclusion already, you've obviously been making a cup of tea, particularly in its current undeveloped form for levelling up. I was very sceptical of it in education. And I think in its place, we now need a long-term strategy from a responsible government to deal with endemic, well-known problems of growing economic inequality and its impact on education that have significantly worsened over the last decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa. Our next speaker is Jonathan Gross, who is lecturer in culture, media and creative industries at King's College London. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philip. And hopefully you can see my slides.
That looks fine, thank you.
Great. So I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about what levelling up might mean for cultural policy, notwithstanding Melissa's suggestion that the term will only be with us for a short while. I'm going to have a think about what is it that we're levelling up if we're seeking to do that. So Arts Council England, Arts Council Great Britain, formed in 1946. I think it's useful to think of it as part of the post-war settlement, part of the welfare state, and ask ourselves, what might arts and cultural policy be in a reimagined welfare state, a reimagined relationship between the citizen and the state at this time of pandemic and beyond? And we can see a thread that has run through arts policy from 1946 fairly consistently up until recently, which is excellence and access, to fund great art and to seek to expand the range of people who access that great art. And that's reflected in the 2010-2020 Great Art and Culture for Everyone strategy of Arts Council England. Just last year, new strategy published, Let's Create, which looks like it might be quite an interesting expansion of that strategic vision. And I want to just say something about one particular initiative, Creative People and Places, which looks like over the last few years, it may have opened up the space for Let's Create in various ways. So there have been various challenges to the excellence and access model over the years, some of them in terms of the inequality regionally and where the investment has gone with more money to London than other places, but also in terms of the kind of implicit paternalism that some people saw within the excellence and access framework. And Creative People and Places, which began funding in England in 2014, is in a sense an experiment in devolved arts investment. It targeted and continues to target the areas of England that have historically received the least amount of funding from Arts Council. And the money doesn't go just to single arts organisations or projects, but to a consortium that's been put together in that town or small city. And that will be not just arts organisations, but civil society organisations, higher education, local authorities, etc. And I did some work looking at the ecosystems that have grown up around the Creative People and Places projects. There are now 30 of them across England. And I very much like what Nikki was saying in her piece around clarity of metaphor being necessary for clarity of thought and action. So my colleague and I, Nick Wilson, were interrogating what it might mean to understand these as ecosystems around an Arts Council investment. I want to make just one point coming out of that research, which is that we found a diversity of strategic aims within the different Creative People and Places initiatives. So this was everything from fairly conventional attempts to expand engagement in the existing arts provision to increasing the demand within a community for more arts investment or more arts opportunities, to new kinds of conversation and consultation between arts programmers, arts organisations and their publics, to enabling new voices to be heard, telling new stories about the town or city, to more expansive ambitions, to use the Creative People and Places investment as the opportunity for different kinds of community development, capacity building, or wider social change. So this brings me back to my question, what needs to be leveled up? How do we understand cultural opportunity and what cultural policy is seeking to expand, if that's part of what it's doing, expanding cultural opportunity? In my own work, I've used the capabilities approach from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which is a way of reframing economic development beyond GDP to thinking about the substantive freedoms that people have, the capabilities to live the lives that they choose for themselves, and asking the question, what are cultural capabilities and how might we think more expansively about cultural opportunity as cultural capability? And I'm working on a project at the moment where we're thinking about cultural capability across 3 dimensions: opportunities for cultural experience, opportunities to develop your own cultural projects, and then opportunities for cultural decision-making and governance. So these, I would argue, need to be the range of things that policymakers are thinking about, and not only about cultural experience. So just as a final thought in raising this question, what needs to be leveled up and what role could arts and cultural policy play within that? Some people might think that arts policy, cultural policy is a fairly parochial concern within the range of policy domains. But I would make the case that at a time in which we're thinking about how to build back better, what should the future look like, what do we learn from the visibilization of our interdependence during the pandemic and the climate crisis, who gets to imagine the future? I think arts and cultural infrastructure has a role to play in creating the spaces in which a wide range of voices are heard in imagining those futures. And artists and cultural practitioners have particular skills in enabling imagination. So that should also be part of what we're looking to level up here, opportunities to imagine the future. I've got some examples that I can share on that from my current research, but I'll save them for the discussion if that's of interest and leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for keeping so perfectly to time. Our next speaker is Will Jennings, who is Director of the Centre for Towns and Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Southampton. So Will, over to you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the context of levelling up and why culture and place might matter with very much a political science hat on, but I occasionally skip into my life as a think tank director of the Centre for Towns and have played a bit of a role in this. So just to give you a bit of background and some context to my kind of take on levelling up, I mean, work that Jerry Stoker and I did in back about 5 years ago, where in an essay for the Political Quarterly, identified the emergence of what we call two Englands in the divergent trajectories of towns and cities. And that research agenda was really about understanding the different pathways that towns and cities were on across the UK in terms of demographics, with cities getting younger, more diverse, higher numbers of graduates, towns aging, and not being on the same sort of trajectory. And our kind of political science analysis was trying to understand how the demographic changes that were going on in different places, interlinked with an economic model based heavily around agglomeration, were creating almost two diverging worlds. I mean, it's very easy, and there's actually just been a great study out by YouGov today to overemphasize the division that we see in British politics today. But there certainly was a sense in which these two different parts of the country were heading in different ways. And in work with the Centre for Towns that we've done, really exploring those divides, in some ways, I think we might say that we're partly responsible for some of the emergence of the levelling up agenda by identifying that both the political challenges are raised by towns, but also the political opportunities that have been seized by the Conservative Party. But in that context, it's important to note that levelling up hasn't emerged in a vacuum. It's a product of a long process of demographic and economic change that has seen places change and voters change in them. So as part of that kind of emergence of a political divide, where we see towns shifting towards more socially conservative parties and outcomes, as we saw in the local elections, and although there's nuance, that really gives rise to a particular sort of politics. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about levelling up and the British experience or the English and Welsh experience of levelling up. I think in kind of British politics, it's very important to understand the different the dynamics of the devolved nations, that it's not just a UK story, that we see some of these same demographic patterns, cultural patterns, feelings of identity in advanced economies and democracies across the world, whether it's in America or in France and Germany, with their distinct local patterns, but these are very common patterns. And what those demographic shifts are manifesting are divides around political trust and resentment. So distrust in peripheral areas towards metropolitan elites, towards government. So there's great work by people like Kathy Kramer in the United States about the politics of resentment. People like Neil Lee at the LSE doing work on the urban-rural divide in political trust. And that a lot of that work tells us that place-based identities and culture really matter in terms of people's feelings of social and economic marginalisation, which in the UK we know are much higher in towns and in the regions. There's some of my colleagues on the TrustGov project that we work on in Southampton, which is funded by the SSE, have just been doing some analysis with IPPR, which shows that the further you get away from London, the less trust you have in MPs and government. And so there's a very important geographical dimension to political discontent. Now, to speak just very briefly about levelling up, I mean, levelling up as a political project is an expression of that realignment of politics that's built on demographic change, where we see socially conservatives parties, whether it's Trump in the US or the Conservatives in the UK, growing their support in more peripheral areas, often former industrial areas that were traditionally voted for the left, with socially liberal, social democratic parties doing better in core cities, which are, as I said, are actually often drivers of economic growth with younger, more diverse populations. So levelling up is both an expression of that realignment of politics, of the growing importance of peripheral areas in declining areas to politics, but it's also a form of political spectacle. And in an essay that Jerry Stoker and Lawrence McKay and I have out in the next couple of days, hopefully in the Political Quarterly, one of the arguments we make, and I'm not sure I have a kind of the same sort of view as Melissa on this actually, is that it's levelling up is about political spectacle. And I actually wonder whether delivering on levelling up as an economic project really matters. It is about government ministers, Boris Johnson appearing in, government ministers having pet projects that they can announce in towns that show that they are thinking and caring about particular places to address those feelings of felt marginalisation by people and populations in peripheral areas. It's about Boris Johnson appearing in a high-vis, and a hard hat on a building site to say that we're delivering project. Levelling up in some ways, a political project is kind of ingenious as a way of expressing government's recognition of there is a problem, but potentially about not addressing the structural change, and to the extent that maybe some of aspects of levelling up will address regional inequality, there are a host of contradictions in levelling up, whether it's really about towns versus cities or about regions versus London, whether it's about centralisation or devolution. Across the whole levelling up, we see a huge number of contradictions, but in some senses politically, I'm not sure that really matters. Just to say, I think culture is really important in levelling up because it matters for identity and feelings of marginalisation, and in the push-pull factors around population movements in work that we've done with Centre for Towns, when you're, for example, looking at foreign direct investment, place, local environment, housing, the sort of kind of physical urban geography is really important in terms of attracting populations to places. And so we'll obviously have a huge amount of focus on skills, further education, higher education, in terms of levelling up. It cannot be underemphasised that the cultural offer is really important. And so focus groups that Centre for Towns ran with young people in Wigan and Hastings last year, we found that culture and kind of and amenities were absolutely crucial for the way that young people viewed the town where they were growing up and their relationship to it and where they wanted to go. And so kind of the cultural offer and physical space in towns is really important. So just to kind of conclude, what are the prospects for levelling up? I think as a political project, it's less about reversing the powerful gravity of agglomeration. I think when I sometimes get myself in policy circles where people look at me with a Centre for Towns hat as if I'm trying to, prevent gravity and say, deny it, right? I don't think we can deny the forces of agglomeration, but what levelling up as a project is about allocating attention and status to particular places and particular groups that feel neglected. And so on that level, I am sceptical both about levelling up as a source or a kind of a mechanism by which we can address deep structural inequalities in the okay, but it's less clear to me that actually failure to deliver will see the government punished in the sense that, and I can say this as someone who's written a book on the politics of competence, who likes to believe in valence politics and performance politics. It's not clear to me that levelling up as a project will bring that sort of retribution from the electorate if levelling up is not delivered.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Owen Lloyd-James, who is Head of Places Strategy at Historic England. Owen, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Yes, no slides from me, and I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
Yes, I'm Head of Places Strategy from Historic England. It's a job title that means nothing to anyone outside of Historic England, but essentially for these purposes, I do a lot of stuff around levelling up, which is why I'm here. And for my 5 minutes, I just want to briefly explain why I'm here and why Historic England has a voice in levelling up discussions. As I'm sure most, or if not all of you will know, we are the government statutory advisor for the historic environment, but simply we are the public body that helps people care for, enjoy and celebrate England's spectacular historic environment. And yes, I did just take that off our website. We are currently managing a programme of high street regeneration, our £92 million High Street Heritage Action Zones programme. By way of context, that represents the biggest ever single investment by government in the UK's built heritage. It is a programme of grants primarily for the repair and reinstatement of historic high streets, along with an associated cultural programme. Importantly, it is targeted on areas where the need and opportunity is greatest, using heritage-led regeneration as a tool for improving broader social, economic and cultural outcomes. Now, I mention our High Streets programme here for two reasons. Firstly, to make the point that heritage and culture not only can play, but are playing an important role in the regeneration of places. And two, that this contribution is recognised in government. After all, they've given Historic England £92 million off the back of it. Right. We can all see that recognition in we can also see that recognition in the 3.6 billion Towns Fund that was mentioned earlier. The purpose of that, and I'm quoting here, is to help increase economic growth with a focus on regeneration, improved transport, better broadband connectivity, skills, and, underlined, culture. And when the Prime Minister, in one of his first speeches in the role, announced the Towns Fund, he made a point of saying, each place in our country has a unique heritage, a unique character, and a unique future. So we're in a place where there is recognition, at least within national government, of the value heritage and culture brings to places and their regeneration. It's worth making the point that this has not always been the case. And it's through that lens that we can look at levelling up. So now turning to look at specifically the issue of levelling up and the recently announced Levelling Up Fund. Now, the forward for the prospectus states that upgrades in local heritage sites strengthen the local economy and build civic identity. Now, as statements go, that is probably a bit of a no-brainer. But including it right at the front of the prospectus of this major new fund, which also goes on to list 3 themes, one of which is cultural investment, it quickly becomes clear that there is an expectation that heritage and culture has an important role to play here. I also just want to dwell briefly on what that prospectus says again, because it talks about strengthening local economy and building civic identity. Now, precisely what is meant by levelling up is something that is hotly debated and has already been come up more than once here this evening. After all, if you're seeking to level up a place, what actually are you trying to achieve? And perhaps more importantly, how do you know when you're finished? To my mind, and it'll be interesting to see if this is discussed later, this issue engages with those 2 points, both the economic and the civic, and conveniently, both of which are features of a successful heritage-led regeneration. So hooray for us again. So why is heritage such a potentially powerful lever in the support for levelling up? Well, firstly, because the demonstrable value of heritage-led regeneration. We see that value at the level of individual buildings, with 69% of commercial occupiers saying historic buildings give a positive image to customers and clients. We know that businesses increasingly see the benefits of being located in historic, characterful premises. And if you want to hear more of those wonderful stats like that, please just Google Heritage Counts, which is the a publication we produce on parts of the Historic Environment Forum annually, and there's a huge amount of data and information there. It's also a fantastic read. Now, importantly, we also see that that value is demonstrated at the level of the place. For example, we know that the quality of the historic environment is as important a factor as road access when businesses decide where to locate. So the historic character of the wider place serves to attract investment. We're seeing this through our High Streets programme. Local distinctiveness even can play a hugely important role in not only attracting people, but also can positively contribute to the community identity and to social cohesion. But heritage also has an important role to play in the levelling up agenda, because it is also dispersed. Local heritage forms an important part of local neighbourhoods, with 99.3% of people in England living less than 1 mile from a listed heritage asset. And it's also worth reflecting that the most frequently visited heritage sites in England are not castles, and they're not country houses. They are the cities and towns with historic character. The historic character of place is the most commonly explored route through which people experience heritage. And it is because of that fact that everyone has access to it, and that if properly harnessed, it can be used as such a positive regenerational resource, that our historic environment and culture have such an important role to play in the levelling up agenda. And I'll stop there, and I think I've even brought us back some time by going under 5 minutes.
You have. That's excellent. You get a medal for being so concise. Thank you very much, Owen. Our next speakers, we have two speakers on this subject, are Helen Nicholson, who is Professor of Theatre and Performance at Royal Holloway, and Jenny Hughes, who's Professor of Drama at the University of Manchester. So Helen, Jenny, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. The reason why we're a double act is that we are working on a shared project together, which is a recently funded AHRC project called Civic Theatre, A Place for Towns. So I think we're on brief in this environment. So thank you very much for the invitation. We recognised in writing this application and in the research that towns have been neglected in theatre studies and more broadly in the academy as part of the cultural offer. So Jenny and I have partnered with Manchester Royal Exchange, who've got a programme that is happening in post-industrial northern towns, with the National Theatre that is working in towns across the country, and particularly valued is the Little Theatre Guild, which is a association of amateur theatres with a network across the UK. So in the time we've got available, then we are turning to the historical to try to understand what the ideas of self-help and self-improvement that were articulated in 19th and 20th century cultural practices and social practices, how they might be used to illuminate the present cultural agenda. The touchstone for this debate is Samuel Smiles' mid-19th century book, Self-Help, which popularised the idea that anyone from any background could succeed through industry, perseverance and self-culture. The book was controversial, appealed to some radical thinkers, but also was also regarded as socially conservative. As theatre and performance scholars, we're interested in the symbolism of self-improvement, perhaps the spectacle of self-improvement and self-help as a civic performance. So we've chosen to tell stories from two different towns and different periods in history. And Jenny is going to start with industrial Rochdale before I come in, and then we'll hopefully have two quite short summary points at the end. Jenny.
Thanks, Helen. I'm going to talk about theatrical performance in late Victorian workhouses as civic spectacles of levelling up. I'm going to speak about these civic spectacles as examples of levelling up that were about the great and good maintaining appearances and securing power in localities and not systematically addressing inequalities. And if you can hear any echoes with the present day there, that's entirely not intentional. This is a story that has a proviso, so listen out for the but at the end. Towards the end of the 19th century, the popular imaginary of the workhouse as bastilles for the poor, as prison houses for poverty, doesn't quite hold up. Although still adhering to strict practices of discipline and aiming to instill habits of good character, usefulness, and work in the poor, by the latter third of the 19th century, workhouse regimes were delivering self-improvement via a softer cultural approach, new practices of welfare and education, and also via a range of cultural provision. Let's turn to Rochdale, December 1877, and to the opening of Durnley Workhouse, later Birch Hill Hospital, where most adult Rochdalians were born, and now converted into high-value apartments. A massive Gothic structure capable of housing 800 paupers, called at the time a credit and an ornament to the town, designed in every detail to facilitate character. The town's great and good, present at the opening, signalling their civic mindedness, had decided to build a workhouse comparable to the best in the land, with a dining hall that was reportedly an excellent one for singing. Award-winning local amateur group, the Orpheus Glee Club, made up of 20 local working men, sang at the opening, and over the next decades, study of workhouse minute books reveal a full cultural calendar each year, made up of entertainments from popular performers, local orchestral bands and choirs, amateur minstrel groups, and temperance and Sunday school entertainments, to name a few. So here comes the but. This is Rochdale, called one of the most alert and socially creative towns in England in the 19th century, and also, of course, birthplace of the social economy in the form of the cooperative movement. The Rochdale pioneers were the first to use the term self-help, according to their own history, and they called it self-help by the people. To quote historian Peter Gurney, under the cooperators, the values of thrift, frugality, and work become practical resources for self-help and for creating what he called a moral bound economy in which it is capital as well as labour that is being disciplined. And just my final point before handing back to Helen for a bit, this multi-directional disciplinary energy is evident in the workhouse, many of the workhouse entertainments, including the performance of the working men at the opening, who had perfected the art of a very elite art form of choral song, choral singing. These were performances that, in their texts, social organisation often, and their affective registers, rang out with reminders of the equality of people and of a shared obligation to care. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to whiz you 200 miles south now and a bit later to the early 20th century to the founding of Letchworth Garden City. And in the early 20th century, obviously the Garden City movement was conceived as a radical solution to the kind of industrial squalor experienced by those Rochdale paupers. And it's interesting that we've heard quite a lot about buildings today, because the Garden City's ethos was evident in the built environment through the boulevards, the arts and crafts houses and green spaces. But it was actually in performance that this vision became embodied, symbolising what the first settlers described as the spirit of the place. And the spirit of the place was a key phrase in the early Garden City movement, and was kind of part of the identity formation of Letchworth as a place. This relationship between the spirit of the place and the ideal of self-improvement, however, was perhaps most clearly shown in Letchworth's first amateur dramatic society, founded in 1807 by theatre enthusiast C.B. Purdom, who was also the town's accountant. Now, Purdom was an interesting character, and he was a strong advocate of amateur theatre as a kind of radical form of theatre. And he thought that it would bring Letchworth citizens together in a common spirit, the spirit of the place. In practice, what happened was that he brought in kind of pretty much all his arty friends, Dent the publishers, Percy Glossop, who was a Vogue illustrator, and and he, Purdham himself, seemed to be kind of evident in pretty much every play they put on. And early on, their first production of Tolstoy's Ivan the Fool, it started a series of kind of letters in the Letchworth Gazette berating local people for not turning up and it not being part of their taste. But the turning point came for the Amateur Theatre Association in Letchworth when they started to laugh at themselves. They started a series of pantomimes that lampooned the eccentricities of Letchworth as a place, and including what they'd come to be known of outside of Letchworth as the kind of cranks who, for their sins, were vegetarian, enjoyed naked dew bathing and wore sandals. I leave you to decide which one of those you prefer to be. By 1911, the Dramatic Society had learnt to laugh at themselves. And the pantomime that year had a plot of the Higher Arts Club, which they called themselves as the Arty Party, led by poet Willie West, played by Purdham, a composer and a converted hooligan who had been reformed by the civilizing power of the arts and had become a passionate advocate of self-improvement. Their secret mission was to run around Letchworth, spreading culture amongst the lower and middle classes, a task made easier by the fact that everyone was disguised in mock medieval costume on the day of the popular May folk pageant. So I was reading this, took a little while to track down the script, read it in Cambridge University Library, and I thought I will take it to Letchworth to read with the pantomime cast today. So over 100 years later, armed with my script, I went to read the script with the current pantomime cast. They'd just done a production of Cinderella, which I'd seen. What was fascinating was that the joke still resonated. They commented that today's civic leaders belonged very firmly to Purdham's High Arts Club, and that their own creative activity and cultural tastes were undervalued. The distance between them was represented by a new gallery, which was, I think, rightly part of Letchworth's urban regeneration scheme, but which they associated with posh, I quote, posh coffee and arty paintings. And they felt that the organic ecologies of their amateur activities and the various voluntary activities they were involved in did not capture the spirit of the place. Now, this leads us to these two stories lead us to two conclusions. Jenny's going to start.
Okay, so how does a cultural history of self-improvement, self-help help us understand levelling up today? 2 points to sum up. So I think what we're trying to say is self-improvement, like levelling up, was a big idea that needed to be popularised via a symbolic currency. It was a big idea to get behind, and one where a top-down social imaginary was meeting all kinds of bottom-up activity. There are many things to be troubled about how that relationship and how that encounter gets played out, for sure. But when the symbolic currency of a big idea meets a locality, and more particularly place-based knowledge, practices, values in a locality, including those that arise from historical legacies, opportunities to strengthen and enrich existing initiatives to improve the life chances of communities arise. And I guess what we're saying is that we're theatre and performance scholars here, and we think spectacle is somewhere where a lot of work happens and can happen.
And I think that's pretty much all we've got to say, so thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Our penultimate speaker is Simon Streeter, who's Professor of History and Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. As I mentioned before, one of the founding parents of history and policy. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip. So I'm going to be continuing the delving into 19th century history here. Is my slideshow showing for people?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I'm afraid for some reason I can't make the slideshow start in the normal way. It's showing you my other slides as well, but never mind. I thought you might like to hear something about a very, very big piece of levelling up that happened in our not too distant past. So this is about the late 19th century, and that graph is to show you the scale of the levelling up that occurred. We tend to think of Victorian Britain as one of great economic success and dynamism. What the graph is showing you is that the life expectancy of the entire nation was static all across the period of greatest economic rapid change, stuck at about 41 years. However, what was going on in the big cities that were creating all the wealth is what you're seeing in the line lower down. And you can see here that there was something close to a kind of disaster going on in those cities, that they were sort of, sorry, I can't seem to get that off. Oh, right. Ah, right. Okay, let's see if this works. Right, that they were dropping to life expectancies as low as 31 in the 1830s and 40s. These are colossal death rates. These means that these cities, although they're producing enormous wealth for the nation and for entrepreneurs, they are deadly places for full of child poverty and appalling death rates. However, as you can also see, something very interesting happens a little bit in the 1850s and 60s, and very definitely from the 1870s and 80s and 90s onwards. The life expectancy in these big cities drives upward decade after decade. Something very, very different is happening in that period. And this is the story of municipal collectivism, and it's driven primarily initially in Glasgow and in Birmingham. I'm just looking at Birmingham here. Under Joseph Chamberlain's mayorship, this is Joseph Chamberlain with his monocle, trademark monocle, fighting an election, a local election in Birmingham. This cartoon depicts him with his cannons of water and gas and health, is what they say on them, and infant life at the back. So the public at the time in the 1870s was well aware of the importance of these things. The key to what he did was to take, we're talking about culture here, he took the word economy and turned it on its head. So economy had been the catchword through the mid-19th century for do nothing local electorates to spend nothing on the urban environment and keep the rate paying bill low. Chamberlain came in and said, no, you just don't understand what real economy is. True economy is investing in us, in our city, in our people. We've got to spend. And he persuaded the council that it should take out an enormous amount of debt in order to buy the city's gasworks, which of course at this time, gas was the energy supply of the entire city, of business and the homes. This is before electricity. So this was an enormous power grab for the city. He bought up the gasworks, and as a result, all the money that was flowing into private hands became revenue for the city of Birmingham, large-scale revenue, and very soon other cities around the country started to copy this model of gas and water socialism, as it was called by those who were objecting to it on ideological grounds. Municipal collectivism is what it actually was. The principles of municipal, why I think we associate this particularly with Chamberlain and Birmingham rather than perhaps Glasgow or some of the other cities where it happened, was in his speeches, there's a very clear political ethos here, a program. He's very clear that something like gas is basically a monopoly good. It's a local monopoly, and that it is sustained by the laws of the state, granting those private companies their monopoly. In these circumstances, they should be in the hands of the people and their representatives. They should be administered for cities, not for profits. Local authorities themselves should be parliaments. They should be proper democratic places. Of course, one of the reasons that Chamberlain is able to get this through at this point in time is that for various reasons to do with national politics, the electorates of big cities have just been changed in 1869 after 25, 30 years, of course, of Chartism and trade unionists arguing for votes for working men. In 1867, there's the Second Reform Act, but more importantly, in 1869, a Franchise Act for local electorates. And this means that Chamberlain realizes quicker than anybody else that you are now, your median voter in a place like Birmingham is not a property owning shopkeeper. It is now a working class man living in a house with his family. So he rises to that very quickly, and his success in the 1870s brings that through. And that's why we see all cities around the country over the next 3 or 4 decades, really investing heavily in sanitation, sewerage, healthcare, and so on. We've got a problem like this today after Chamberlain came in after 40 or 50 years of the first period of classical liberal free market deregulation. We've had 40 years of it now. On the left, you see a graph of the Gini coefficient, which just absolutely rose spectacularly from 1979 through to 1990 and has stayed at that very high, very unequal level ever since. And on the right, you can see the official definition of child poverty rising at exactly the same time, 1979 to 1990, it doubles from 15 to 35, nearly 35%. There's a slight decline in the era of New Labour, Sure Start and things like that. But the decade of austerity is now driving child poverty back up again. So if we need to level up, if the government wants to be judged on leveling up, and if individual cities want to be judged on leveling up, I would suggest they start with the official measure of child poverty and seeing where they can get to with that. I think an example of maybe something like, obviously history never repeats. I'm not saying what's going on in Preston is identical with what was happening in Joseph Chamberlain's Birmingham, but we have towns like Preston. We could also talk about Coventry, which is a marmot city. We've got various towns around the country that are pioneering some very interesting new ways of doing something. In Preston, it's to do with committing to progressive procurement and spending locally, and there's some stats there about how much of an effect they've been having. Interesting, by complete chance this morning I noticed that Rowan Moore has written a review of Matthew Brown, who is the leader of Preston, has just produced a book called Paint Your Town Red, and Rowan Moore has reviewed that this morning in The Guardian. As I said, there are also marmot cities as an example, cities that are putting health and health equity at the center of their policies and are trying to make their policies conform with that. So I think health equity could be another judgment call for a leveling up. If people were talking earlier about measures rather than merely rhetoric, I think there's a couple of quite hard measures there, child poverty and health equity, which we could really hold the government to. As with the Liberals in Birmingham in the 1870s, the Labour in Preston has found that this pays electoral dividends. They did very well in the elections just a couple of weeks ago and returned very strongly. So, final little bit of shameless advertising. This is some of what you've heard is coming out as part of this book, which will appear in September, which has been keeping myself and my partner, Hilary Cooper, sane during the last month, giving us something to do, quite exacting. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. And our final speaker now is Andrew Haldane, who is the Chief Economist of the Bank of England. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Catherine, and evening, everyone. It's thundering here too, actually, which is perfect atmospheric conditions for my lightning talk. I'm delighted to be talking on this issue, which is, of course, hugely important, and particularly so from a sort of cross-disciplinary perspective. Been some fantastic talks so far this evening. Certainly huge eye-openers to me. I'm going to try and provide a bit of an economist lens on the issue, albeit a slightly wider angle lens than the one you might typically expect from economists, I hope. So before lockdown struck, I'd spent several years touring around all four corners of the UK, speaking to people from as varied a backgrounds as possible, not just companies and CEOs and finance directors, but workers in those companies, charities, and those that were helping community and faith groups, all the key local institutions, really. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz calls this approach, an expression I love, deep hanging out. And my deep hanging out across the UK's cities and towns and villages was without question the most gratifying thing I've done in my 30 years at the Bank of England. But it was also pretty much the most informative, because those meetings taught me huge amounts about the everyday economic issues that matter most to people, the ones that shape their lives day to day, from universal credit to insecure work, from doorstep lenders to deserted high streets. Yes, there is sometimes madness in crowds, but more often I find there is wisdom too, folk wisdom, and plenty of it. And having spent time harvesting that folk wisdom, it's been interesting to see how many of the issues I unearthed back then in the town halls, on the high streets, and the community centres are now shaping politics today. But as well as giving me a different and I think hopefully deeper lens on the economy, that deep hanging out also, I think, taught me something rather more fundamental, which is that you have to earn the right to speak by first listening. I'll come back to that point towards the end. Let me just discuss a couple of issues that have struck me from those regional visits, starting with a real positive. It's one that's been touched upon already this evening. For a small island, indeed, in part because we are a small island, Britain has an incredible richness and diversity in its regional cultures, practices, dialects, buildings, and attitudes. If you drew a cultural map of the UK, I think you'd find an incredibly variegated picture of cultures, subcultures, and subcultures, often separated by no more than a few miles. Owen and Johnson both discussed this at some length. This is a source, rightly, I think, of considerable civic pride. That word's been used already this evening. And for many people, many communities, it delivers their very sense of identity, another word used a lot this evening. It's what gives people their sense of belonging. And that cultural diversity can, I think, be a source of real strength. As with any ecosystem, diversity can build resilience. Just witness the more than 4,000 mutual aid groups that sprung up very locally during the pandemic. And that local identity can also provide a degree of unity of purpose, which we know to be absolutely essential for getting stuff done. It's the local social glue, and that's all positive. Let me switch then to the dark side of regional diversity, which is regional disparity. Because if you travel across Britain, as I'm sure you all have done, often sitting cheek by jowl are fairly staggering examples of differences in people's lived experiences. In those left behind towns and cities, there has been a visible, sometimes audible, tearing of the social fabric, a depletion of what Putnam calls social capital. It's been going on for many years now. It's on the high streets, in those town halls, it's in those community centres. And this depletion of social capital has in turn caused subsidence in the foundations on which those local economies just discussed by Sam and others have been built, in some cases over many centuries. It's there on the high streets and the community centres. It's there in the data too, where on the data, the UK stands out as one of the most regionally unequal advanced economies in the world along most dimensions. Those differences have been widening for at least 50 years. In fact, you have to go right back to late Victorian times, times when Jenny was describing Rochdale, to find a time when regional disparities were as large as they now are. They show up in financial outcomes, but they also show up in broader measures of well-being, such as the ones that Simon just mentioned, including health, homelessness, poverty, and deprivation. Someone living in Sunderland, which is the place where I was born, has an income around 1/3 lower, and a life expectancy about 5 to 10 years shorter than someone in Surrey, where I now live. And that shouldn't, I'm not suggesting by that this is a north-south story or even a rural-urban story, because it's not. These disparities are as large or larger, in fact, within regions or within cities as they are between them. As all politics is local, turns out all economics is as well, and often very local. Those are the reasons why levelling up has risen to the top of the political agenda, I think. And for me, at the moment, we find ourselves, in fact, with a divine coincidence between what is economically sensible, what is socially just, and what is politically expedient. And in fact, that gives me greater confidence, perhaps greater confidence in the speakers, in fact, that levelling up will last on the agenda and could indeed have legs. As Simon just showed us, and as international experience demonstrates, levelling up is eminently doable. We have done it ourselves at times in the relatively recent historical past, provided the right policies are put in place. So let me end by saying a little bit about what those policies might be. What are the legs in levelling up, or what should they be? Well, I think from potentially a very long list, let me focus just on one dimension, which I believe to be particularly crucial, and that area is governance. Because the key to success for me will be to use that rich cultural diversity and identity that I mentioned, if you like, the good cholesterol, as the asset which then helps solve the problem of deep regional disparity, the bad cholesterol. The way to do that, I think, is through a far greater degree of devolution and decentralization than we've ever seen previously in our recent history. That means endowing local towns, cities and regions with the people, the power and the monies they need to make decisions, fund those decisions and implement those decisions. Because the truth is, it's no coincidence that the UK is one of the most centralized, in governance terms, advanced economies in the world, as well as being one of the most spatially unequal. That isn't coincidence. That's almost certainly causality. Local, often very local, problems can only be solved in my view, using local knowledge to craft local plans designed and implemented by local people acting with local agency. In short, as I've said previously, you don't level up from the top down. Deep hanging out taught me that the way to understand and solve local problems and to earn the trust of the people living there is to start by giving power away. And the self-same solution, I think, is now needed at a national level to close regional disparities and to rebuild that social and cultural capital necessary to reunite the UK. That means endowing regions, cities, towns with what I sometimes call a holy trinity, which is people, power and monies, and thereby give them the capacity to be masters of their own destiny. Philip, on that, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We are about 10 to 7, so you've got a good half hour question and discussion. I'm going to round up some of the comments that have come in on the chat rather than reading them all out, so it would just take too long. And I would say I would invite our speakers to come in. If you feel like coming in on a question, either use the hand raising function, the electronic hand raising, or just low tech, wave at me. I can sort of see you all pretty much. And Catherine and Nikki, also, if you'd like to come in on any of these questions, please indicate. And to audience members, it's nice to have the kind of long comments, but it's kind of easier as chair if you basically say, I'd like to ask Simon or Melissa this question, and it's probably more likely to get a specific answer. Let me just begin then by sort of really summarizing some of the comments that have come in so far. I suppose there's a big question we need to ask is should we really be taking levelling up seriously at all? I mean, and Will has suggested that one way of reading it is really just a spectacle or performance, and that this is a kind of, it's almost a symptom of the new politics, that it's almost more important to say you're going to do something and weave this alternative reality around it than actually do anything. It's Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts. If you say you're levelling up long enough, people will believe it no matter what you do, even if you don't do very much at all. So should we understand it in that way? Should we understand it? Abigail says, is this perhaps a sort of slightly different way of putting this, a low risk rhetorical agenda, but one that specifically favors private rather than public interests? Or should we, as Simon, I think Andy suggested, actually take it more seriously and say that there clearly is the need for levelling up and the need to tackle regional disparities. And we do have models of this, both in Simon's civic collectivism and in contemporary examples. He cited Preston, that it does have legs, as Andy said. So overall question, how do we understand levelling up? Do we take it seriously or not? Who would like to come in? Melissa, yeah. Melissa, you're muted.
Oh, rookie mistake. I definitely prefer Andy's model and the Preston model, which I think is something that Labour should think, the political left should think very seriously about. But just, I would comment on the idea that Boris Johnson is simply performing a spectacle, which is quite a cynical view, and I would agree with that up to a point. But I think he's doing more than that. I think he is tapping into a kind of middle England cultural heritage that people feel has been neglected in a possibly too woke world. There's something about the cultural language that he speaks, and also there's something about his, I think it's very much a sort of prime minister led government. There's something about his eccentricity that when I was listening to the wonderful presentation about Rochdale and Letchworth Gardens, I can sort of see Boris Johnson in medieval costume, and I'm being absolutely serious. I think there's something about him as an Englishman, although he actually economically is from the most elite, social class that you can be. He gets something about a lot of what's being talked about here in a way that a too well-behaved, economically oriented political left has not got for a while. That would be my observation.
Thank you. Owen, you wanted to come in next.
Yes, thank you. To answer the question, should we take it seriously? It's quite an easy question for me to answer because of my perspective, approaching it from the historic American perspective. Yes, we should, because there is the opportunity for substantial levels of investment going into places that have not received that investment before. From an organisation and a heritage perspective, yes, we do need to take that seriously, because also if we don't take it seriously now, that kind of investment might not be targeted in that way in the future.
Owen, just while you're on, I mean, there was a question in the chat really about what kind of historical buildings get privileged in this process, and do you have a view on that?
Yes, because I mean the comment made, and I do apologise, I can't see the chat function on my screen at the moment, so I don't know who made it, and I apologise for whoever did it. It was a very good point. But that gentrification does not always come with regeneration, and indeed in designing these schemes, one of the things we have to do is to try and avoid that. To avoid that, you make sure you put those communities that sit at the heart of that place at the heart of the regeneration scheme. That place has to serve the people that use that place, and hopefully through that we don't go down that route of gentrification. But coming back to the point about kind of specific assets and heritage assets and how those decisions are made, I would argue that, again, this is particularly true of the kind of funds and discussion here. They're not asset-based schemes. They're not schemes that look at a particular building or a particular monument and say that needs regeneration. There are schemes that look at the place and look at what's necessary, what's needed in that place. Now, not always, and I'm going to say that as a historic England member of staff and with other members of staff on the call, that money might not always be best spent on heritage and on those historic buildings. But you have to look at what the place needs and where that money needs to go. And that's where you start. You don't necessarily start at, oh, that's a historic building, let's spend money on that.
Thank you very much. Will, I think you wanted to come in. Then I'll take Simon. Yeah.
No, I mean, I was just going to come back to this point of, should we take levelling up seriously? And I think the point of the argument around spectacle is not to say that we shouldn't take levelling up seriously. In fact, it's an argument to say we should take it very seriously as a political and cultural project, but to say that the performance of levelling up is separate in terms of kind of visual and a set of projects is separate from the set of structural inequalities that we might identify across a whole range of economic, social life. So, for example, about tackling up things like the Towns Fund provide important civic cultural projects, but they are not the same as addressing some of the underlying drivers of deep geographical inequality in this country. And I think the point is, in some ways, that I still think in pure ideological terms, there is a lot of confusion about what is being leveled up. I think we all agree that I think there's a very long economic geographical history of geographical inequality in the UK for very understandable reasons, and it's a really tricky problem to solve. And to date, most of the policy solutions have been at a more kind of symbolic level. I think I was going to kind of take up Andy's point around devolution and decentralization, to the extent that I completely agree that I've long argued that, and Jerry Stoker and I have long argued that devolution and decentralization are crucially important. But it does raise a puzzle, because this government has not demonstrated much keenness to devolve or decentralize power. It is not in the mindset of the British state more generally, and things like the operation of the Towns Fund to date haven't demonstrated or exhibited a great deal of devolution. And the work that, for example, Chris Hanretti did around the kind of pork barrel politics of the Towns Fund suggests that there are a lot of institutional and partisan constraints that are holding back what I think many of us would hope from in levelling up as an agenda.
Well, there are a lot of other people waiting to come in from our speakers, and I'm going to bring in Simon in a minute. I just wanted, again, while you're in the spotlight, so to speak, I just wanted to take up a point you made in your presentation. You talked about in some of the kind of the red wall seats, electorates moving towards, you described more socially conservative parties. It just struck me, because I was sort of growing up in Hull in the 1970s, which was a Labour stronghold, but it was pretty socially conservative. I mean, it wasn't there wasn't the swinging 60s or even the swinging 70s up in Hull. There's still quite a lot strong sort of Irish Catholicism represented in the council, and in people like Kevin McNamara, local MP. Is it maybe that not that the electorate has changed, but Labour has changed?
I think that's quite an acute observation. You could almost say that actually, and certainly that's true in some regards, that actually those places maybe haven't changed as much, but actually core cities, major cities are the places where there's been most social change. And so if you're thinking about the growing divides, you might say that cities have become socially liberal, younger, more kind of full of younger professionals. And so I think there's certainly an interesting observation there. I think there's a little bit, a lot of these things we're talking in relative terms, because you could argue that, I often do, that actually we're a far more socially liberal society than we were 30, 40 years ago. So on one level, we can often talk about a swing to the right on culture, but often political scientists like me are talking in relative terms, that we are just broadly a more socially liberal society than we were 30, 40 years ago. And when Jerry Stoker and I started our research on this, actually, when we looked at some of the survey questions in things like the British election study, expecting to see actually quite, socially conservative views in towns, in red wall type seats, you actually found that people were still really very socially liberal on questions of sexuality or gender and so forth. So often it's about relative terms, but I think there's something there. But I think what has happened in a lot of those former industrial towns are places in which for example, for the Labour Party had very strong social ties and identities around place, economy, and kind of political identity. Those have been weakened due to a huge number of social economic changes and the aging of the population. I think in some ways it's interesting, in a lot of our commentary about politics and society is incredibly nostalgic about a world that we're not going back to.
Thank you very much. Simon Street has been waiting very patiently to come in. So Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Philip. I was just also looking at the chats. There's an awful lot of very interesting things being said, which I'll try to resist, because otherwise it could go on forever. So yeah, I think very, very good to hear Andy Haldane being so committed to the idea of devolution. I think that the big issue there is, obviously there is the problem of, as Alistair Reid said in his comment, since Mrs. Thatcher took office, we've had a central government, when it's Tory, that's really very anti the bigger local government areas, although they've now got Andy Street in Birmingham, so it's interesting to see how they work with him. But I think that there is a longer term big problem, which you can see for decades, if not 200 years, which is the paranoia of the Treasury, which has to be, if you are going to do any significant devolution involving significant flows of funds, you're going to have to get the Treasury happy with it. And maybe Andy has got the intellectual and technical tools and apparatus to be giving his thought to that problem, because I would say that what is absolutely crucial is to devise a system of generous funding for local authorities, to give them the discretion so that people with energy and power and initiative want to go into local politics because they can actually do something. But it's going to have to be done in a way that the Treasury is not going to freak out that it could end up picking up the tab for profligate local authorities, which has been an absolute standard objection and problem expressed in many ways over the last 150, 200 years. I've seen it in all sorts of documents and studies that it's a real bogey for the Treasury, and it has to be, they will have to be made happy in order for anything like this to happen, and I think it's very important. So it's a crucial problem to crack. I think in terms of local pride, yes, this is a brilliant resource to tap into. Using local rivalry is just a great way of energizing our local authorities and our communities and cities. And what you need for that is authoritative and regular measures, to comparative measures. In the 19th century, which the story I told you, lying behind that was an incredible driver from central government, which was William Farr publishing week after week after week, month after month, the death rates, the infant mortality rates in the cities. And these were reported in local newspapers. And he was basically dripping on the local councillors and the local electorate about, and he was very happy to draw very invidious comparisons about how badly some of the cities were doing. He even created a league table of the biggest 20 cities, ranking them according to their mortality to try and shame them into doing something about it. And so I think what Mariana Mazzucato calls the performativity of measures is something that we need to really get into. And, you know, we need to be publicizing child poverty rates in different cities, educational outcomes in different cities, health performance in different cities. These things need to be, we need to create a public discourse that cares about these outcomes. And then you will see rivalry beginning to kick in, and that's giving you a lot of energy. Okay, I'll shut up.
I'm gonna, other people want to come in, so I'll just, and Jonathan, Helen, and Nikki, and before I bring them in, can I just feed in a couple of other points from the chat in case people want to take it up. Firstly, Lauren is asking about young people, how we might meaningfully engage young people in this levelling up process. And Caroline, who really started the chat and sort of come back in again. I mean, Caroline's very much emphasizing something that we haven't talked about, which is the natural rather than the built environment and climate change. And perhaps counterintuitively for a right-wing populist government, the Johnson government is pushing measures to combat climate change on the international agenda. So how might that be fitted into the domestic agenda? As I say, if people would like to touch on those points, please do. But Jonathan has been waiting, so over to you next.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question as to whether we should take the levelling up agenda seriously by asking whether we need to read it in quite close relation to Brexit, and in a sense think of it as the domestic policy sequel, if you like. It's a recognition on the part of a Brexit Prime Minister that the next story has to come along. So the questions that we've been discussing in terms of, is it really about material change or is it just a symbolic intervention? Of course, those questions apply to Brexit itself and asking what difference it will make to the lives of the people who voted for it. And I think here, Andy's optimistic account of this agenda is very interesting for the way in which he has put emphasis on devolution, because of course taking back control can operate within the internal dynamics of British democracy as well as its relationship with Europe. So there's a question about the extent to which there's a demand on the part of those who voted for Brexit for taking back control from the central authority of the state. So I think this could be really an interesting dimension of the levelling up agenda to observe. And in terms of whether it's likely to happen that this devolution will take place, it seems to me that Scotland is very likely to be a big headache for several years for this government. And actually, it would be very interesting to see whether there was appetite for further devolution whilst also looking to manage that situation. So those were just some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Helen, would you like to come in next?
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to return to the idea of the spectacle and the theatrical as part of the levelling up agenda. And I wanted to, I kind of had my hand raised for a bit because I wanted to kind of come in at the idea that this is only spectacle is actually a misinterpretation, I think, of the power of spectacle. And that there is both spectacle and performance in all its multiple forms creates local identities. It creates a sense of aspiration, and it might also be illogical. It might not follow the logical it's an emotional thing. It doesn't necessarily follow the logic of kind of knowing what the stats are and then acting accordingly. In terms of the kind of spectacle that's mounted in towns and cities, then my question is, if spectacle is a powerful way of raising aspiration, and we have evidence over time that it is, who creates the spectacle? Whose spectacle is it? And on that level, if this is allied to the civic, which a number of people have said it is, who is the civic? Is this majority white men, for example, middle-aged white men? Is it young people who are brought into that space? Is it people from Black and global majority? What are the kind of parameters of the civic, and what's the history of the civic in order for us to have, us being, normal citizens, to have pride within it? And I think that pulls that round full circle to the kind of idea that Andy was talking about in terms of the local. People need to get behind the local, but they will only get behind the local if there's an alignment between different forms of performance and different ways in which they affectively engage with the local. So rather than saying that it is just a spectacle, and I recognise that what was intended by that was saying there is no economic heft behind it. What I would say is that we ignore the spectacle at our peril, and that if we're really going to engage with the long history of levelling up, or indeed the long history of aspiration, then part of that is to recognise what the power play is that creates a certain version of the civic and a certain version of the local.
Thank you very much. Nikki, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would just kind of support Helen there, that I agree that obviously the performative enacts things, and that the spectacle is disruptive. We also don't know what it's going to do. It's, we can think of something like the carnivalesque being a language there, and that to separate it from the economic isn't necessarily always useful. But for me, the question here that's really pressing around the Towns Fund in particular is one that Abby's raised that we haven't really discussed, which is who is doing this, who is creating these narratives for towns. And I don't mean only in terms of how representative are they, how young are they, how diverse are they. I also mean, are they public or are they private capital? Are they local communities? Or is this process, as we're seeing, being mediated quite heavily by consultants? So we're going to see a version of the local that's being kind of off the peg and given to communities to pick up if they want to be successful in getting this funding. And then that really changes the possibility, all the possibilities that Andy outlined that are possible in the local, that unite spectacle and economics and cultural capital and can be a mobilizing capacity. If the consultants are mediating those things, who are then actually also doing the building, and quite a narrow range of consultants, then I think we really need to look really carefully at that space and what our aspirations and hopes for that space are.
Thank you very much. Will, is that a legacy hand, or would you like to come in again?
I mean, I think it's good to hear people saying that, kind of spectacle is not just about performance, but it's about something deeper. And I think that's definitely something we feel about. It's about responding to people's felt feeling, felt orientation towards their place and so forth. I'm not sure I've thought greatly about legacy in that regard. I mean, I think it does raise, levelling up as an agenda raises loads of interesting questions about what it leaves behind. But I think that the people's why things like high streets, for example, are really important. This is about the lived environment and people's day-to-day lives. And so actually that's, in some ways, I think there's the underemphasized aspect of levelling up as well. I think Rishi Sunak called it kind of infrastructure of everyday life. And so I think that feeling in which culture and heritage is part of people's day-to-day environment, I think is going to be one of the interesting areas of legacy. So it's not necessarily about grand projects, but about, kind of material local legacy.
Thank you. Melissa's got her hand up, so please.
Yes, I can't find my little yellow hand, so I have to do my
Don't
real.
worry, it's very, very visible.
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation and in a way do it in a personal way about the history of local democracy. So I come from a long line of elected politicians, and my great grandfather was the equivalent of Joseph Chamberlain in London, Sir John Benn, the head of the London County Council, that had a very similar sort of kind of nuts and bolts municipal project, you know, sewers and things like that. But in my own lifetime, I came out of the LSE in 1979, just as Margaret Thatcher was elected, and have watched local democracy become drained of cultural significance, popular interest, and then in the austerity years of significant funds in order to do what they needed to do. And it seems to me, therefore, I'm having this full circle feeling that a combination of factors from that and that of course applies a great deal to education, to pick up the point about private interests. Education is now not shaped for good or for bad by local interests. It is shaped from the centre and from privately and charitably interest bodies that often don't emerge out of the local or have much real accountability to the local. But I think that the COVID crisis, the feeling people have that local NHS has done better than test and trace and contractors, the emergence of someone like Andy Burnham as a cultural figure, the king of the north, and then I'm amazed and delighted to hear Andy Haldane say that his deep hanging out, which is a version of understanding a local area, only he presumably came back to Surrey eventually, you know, this is a changed landscape. And I think it's very cheering, actually. I don't know how much it's got to do with what Boris Johnson wants to do, because my guess is he wants to put private money where he can. He wants to keep central control where he can. But this event tonight has convinced me that the Preston model and the Manchester model and the return to some kind of genuine local democracy is the more radical answer to what is levelling up and what should it mean. So that's what I'm taking from tonight. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you. Simon, very, very quickly, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, just something I wanted is links to one or two things. I think that it would be crucial to energise local government for somebody. Labour would be the obvious one to do it, to really go for bringing the voting age down to 16 at least, if not 15, in local elections as the first step. I would like to see this in national elections, but whoever grabs that will get an enormous amount of kudos from the young, and it will energize local, just in the way in which enfranchising working class men energized local government around the country in the late 19th century. You know, imagine the invigoration of discussions in every single secondary school around the country if the people in the lesson talking about PHSE and our constitution or lack of it, etc., have actually got the vote and will vote, you know, this year or next year or something. And I think that there is, you know, Greta Thunberg has shown us that people aged 15 are just as bloody sensible as the average of the rest of us, and deserve to be taken seriously and listened to and given the vote. And I think it's time to move the vote down age-wise to this group, and we could start with local government.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's partly a response to Lauren's very, very interesting question. There's a specific question from Paul, and I'm afraid it will probably have to be the last one. And Paul says for Nikki, Andy, and Simon, is devolution much of a guarantee of levelling up? Canada has a federal system that for healthcare works awfully. Healthcare in the Eastern Maritime provinces is poor because of the expectations of these declining or declined regions having to bear most of the cost. Aren't we possibly going to entrench inequality in certain less well-off regions? Maybe Andy, I could go to Andy for a comment on that.
I think Andy has dropped out of the meeting, Philip.
Okay.
Yeah.
In which case, back to Simon for.
Okay. Well, I think history again, you know, it's full of this problem. The classic way that it was dealt with was by what was called an equalisation fund. So the Metropolitan Works Committee in London in the mid-19th century had to deal with these parts of London that didn't want to be spending in, and it was pioneered with the poor law and then with sanitary infrastructure to basically say, no, you can't just sit in your rich parts of London and have your very low local rates. You've got to, start mucking in with everybody else. And so local devolution needs some form of national equalization to accompany it. The whole thing needs, careful attention, and you can't deal with this in a few minutes. It's got the devil's in the detail, but it can be done. But you need to energize local rivalry and pride. But you also need to have various kinds of funding arrangements that enable the poorer parts of the country to be genuinely assisted where it's it's something that is a valid thing to do. So yeah, it is a problem that unless you keep an eye on that, if you just localism can go completely in the wrong direction from the point of equity unless you keep a very close eye on this aspect.
Thank you very much. Nikki, I'm aware that we're nearly out of time. I'm going to give you the final word just to round up. But before I sign out, let me say what an absolute pleasure it's been to participate in this event. We've managed to pack a huge amount of information and discussion and thought into a very short period of time, and our speakers have worked wonderfully to time. And thank you so much to Catherine and to Nikki for putting this program together, to our events manager Gemma for helping to organize it, and to all of you for your wonderful questions and ideas. And we will return to this issue, no doubt. But thank you all very much. And finally, over to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Philip. And thank you to you as well for hosting it so dynamically and energetically and bringing us together. And to Will and Michael, other people on the team who haven't spoken tonight, have been important to it. I think if I had one last word, it would be internationalization rather than localism here, because I think we've got a lot to learn from the ways in which other countries have wrestled with this. We're not alone in doing this. And so I think that would be a kind of comparative study of understanding this and putting it in a kind of a wider context would be the thing I'd want to end with. And maybe I'd want to think about kind of collaboration and cohesion rather than only rivalry as well as a model for the social and as a model for this evening.
Yeah, and well, thank you. And please do remember that the History and Policy website publishes policy papers, 2,000 to 4,000 word pieces. If you feel inspired to write something by today and you feel that your expertise allows you to do something that would be of interest to us all, please send us, or even a shorter opinion piece, which is a sort of standard blog length of 800 to 1,000 words, and events, witness seminars, anything that you think we could collaborate on together, please do just write to us. But thank you all for this the wonderful discussion this evening, and enjoy the rest of your day.